Hey everyone, welcome back. Go ahead and get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, grab a blanket, or just let your phone screen fade into the dark. Tonight, we're drifting through the slow, tragic unraveling of monarchy itself. That long, painful slide from absolute power to complete irrelevance. For thousands of years, kings and queens ruled with divine confidence and occasionally divine stupidity. They believed crowns were eternal, bloodlines were sacred, and peasants were basically decorative. But as it turns out, history doesn't really care about fancy hats or inherited egos. One by one, thrones started cracking under the weight of war, greed, and public rage, until even the grandest monarch.
Hey again. If you're still awake, first, congratulations. You've outlasted at least half the monarchs in this story. Tonight, we're gliding into the twilight years of European royalty. The part where kings and emperors start realizing the world doesn't revolve around them anymore, even if their portraits still do. Because by the early 20th century, the age of divine right was basically on life support. Empires were disintegrating, revolutions were trending, and monarchs were trying to look relevant without actually doing anything. Let's float first to the German Empire, a place where one man's mustache almost became a national symbol. The last German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. So, Germany didn't actually exist as a unified country until 1871. Before that, it was just a collection of princely fragments, each one ruled by someone's uncle. Then along came Otto von Bismarck, a man who practically bullied the states into forming one empire. At the top sat Kaiser Wilhelm I, and later his grandson, Wilhelm II, the last German emperor. Wilhelm was born with a paralyzed left arm and a gigantic ego, which is a dangerous combination. He overcompensated constantly, desperate to be seen as powerful, manly, and destined for greatness. His idea of subtlety was yelling at subordinates and collecting military uniforms like Pokemon cards. He was the kind of guy who'd pick a fight at dinner and then wonder why nobody invited him again. Under his rule, Germany transformed into an industrial and military giant. But Wilhelm's diplomacy skills, let's just say they were about as effective as a chocolate cannon. He alienated allies, threatened enemies, and managed to make everyone in Europe deeply uncomfortable. By 1914, when his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, got tangled in a Balkan mess, Wilhelm couldn't resist jumping in. The result? World War I, also known as the event that ruined literally everything. 4 years later, the empire was gone. Germany was defeated, starving, and furious. Wilhelm fled to the Netherlands in 1918, where he lived out his days chopping wood, reading bad newspapers, and pretending he didn't cause a world war. He died in 1941, still convinced monarchy would make a comeback. It didn't. Germany never crowned another emperor. Instead, it got a republic, which, admittedly, didn't go smoothly the first time. But that's another sleepy disaster for another night.
Hey again. Welcome back to The Quiet Aftermath, the part of the story where the crowns are packed away, the palaces are empty, and all that's left are old titles, faded portraits, and some very confused former monarchs wondering what exactly to do now. Because losing a throne isn't just political, it's deeply awkward. One day you're literally God's chosen ruler, and the next you're explaining to a border guard while your passport says formerly emperor. So tonight, we're wandering through that soft twilight of royal exile. The lonely villas, the borrowed mansions, and the slightly tragic sense of people who once ruled millions, now just trying to remember where their rent is due. Nicholas II and the Romanov Aftermath. We left Tsar Nicholas II and his family in part 1 at their tragic end in Yekaterinburg. But the Romanov story didn't stop there. Survivors, distant cousins, uncles, ladies-in-waiting, scattered across Europe like lost chess pieces. Some fled with jewels sewn into their clothing. Others escaped on fishing boats, disguised as servants. Paris, London, and Berlin became little hubs of exiled nobility. There were even Romanov pretenders, distant relatives who claimed they were the true heirs to the throne, despite having about as much power as a retired mall Santa. One of them, Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, opened an embroidery business. Another, Prince Felix Yusupov, the man who famously helped kill Rasputin, spent his life suing people for making movies about him. For the exiled royals, daily life became a strange mix of nostalgia and mild embarrassment. They still hosted dinner parties, still used their titles, but nobody really cared anymore. They were relics in a world that had moved on, living symbols of a system everyone was trying to forget. The Austrians in exile. Over in Austria, Emperor Karl I's widow, Empress Zita, carried herself with the kind of dignity only someone who's lost everything can pull off. She raised 8 children alone in Switzerland, always insisting her husband was still the rightful emperor. It was like living in a never-ending historical reenactment. Their son, Otto von Habsburg, became the face of a new kind of royalty, one that gave up power but held on to charm. He studied, gave lectures, and even served in the European Parliament. He once joked that his job was to make sure Europe doesn't fall apart again, which, to be fair, is an admirable rebrand. By the late 20th century, the Habsburgs had transitioned from rulers to aristocratic influencers, the kind who still attend royal weddings but have to buy their own plane tickets. The German royals who refused to quit. The German royal families had it worst. When the Kaiser fled in 1918, dozens of smaller kings, dukes, and princes lost their thrones too. Suddenly, Germany had no fewer than 22 deposed monarchs wandering around trying to figure out what normal life meant. Many of them stayed in their castles as private citizens, though private is relative when your house has 300 rooms. Some sold off land, others opened their estates to tourists, and a few tried to dabble in politics again. One of the strangest was Crown Prince Willem, the Kaiser's son. He spent years in exile, then returned to Germany and flirted briefly with the Nazis, who predictably used him for propaganda and then ignored him. He died in 1951, bitter and irrelevant, his crown long since melted into history. It's funny, in a melancholy way. Generations of men raised to believe they were chosen by God, slowly realizing they couldn't even get elected to a city council. The Italian royals, exiled by their own people. After Italy voted to abolish the monarchy in 1946, the House of Savoy was officially banished. Literally, a constitutional law forbade all male heirs from ever setting foot in Italy again. So they wandered. Switzerland, Portugal, Egypt, King Umberto II, the last king of Italy, nicknamed the May King because he ruled for exactly 34 days, spent the rest of his life in exile in Portugal. He was polite, melancholy, and forever hopeful that someday Italy would call him back. It never did. His son, Vittorio Emanuele, finally returned decades later after the ban was lifted, only to immediately cause scandals involving guns, gambling, and general embarrassment. It was as if the royal family had learned absolutely nothing from history. The irony: Italians who once dreamed of unifying under a king now mostly remember them as trivia questions. The Greeks and their endless exile. And then there's Greece. The modern Greek monarchy was a 19th century import. Literally, their first king, Otto, was a Bavarian prince sent over by Europe's great powers because apparently being Greek wasn't a requirement. Over time, the Greek royal family became a revolving door of abdications and comebacks. But by the 1970s, after another coup and another crisis, the people voted to abolish the monarchy for good. King Constantine II, who had ruled through some of the messiest years, went into exile in London. He spent decades living quietly, playing tennis, and attending royal events where everyone else still technically outranked him. When he finally returned to Greece in the 2000s, it wasn't to reclaim power, just to retire. He died in 2023, not as a king, but as a footnote in a country that had long since moved on. It's a familiar pattern: monarchs clinging to dignity while history quietly closes the door behind them. The Egyptian king who lived like a movie. Let's wander a bit further south, to Egypt, where one of the most cinematic royal downfalls took place. King Farouk Erst was young, wealthy, and hopelessly addicted to luxury. He owned hundreds of suits, dozens of cars, and allegedly even the world's largest collection of Coca-Cola bottles. He also had a habit of firing ministers like he was changing socks. In 1952, the military decided enough was enough. They launched a coup, and Farouk fled the country on his yacht, taking his luggage, a few golden bathroom fixtures, and a lifetime supply of bad decisions. He lived in Italy, growing steadily fatter and sadder, until his death in 1965. His downfall became a kind of modern parable. Even in the 20th century, kings still thought they were untouchable, until someone reminded them otherwise. The Spanish exception. But not all royal exiles stayed exiled. Take Spain, for example. After the Spanish Civil War, General Franco ruled as a dictator. But oddly enough, he liked the idea of monarchy. So he raised Prince John Carlos as his hand-picked successor. When Franco died in 1975, John Carlos became king and then promptly surprised everyone by turning Spain into a democracy. He legalized political parties, supported elections, and basically saved the monarchy by making it unnecessary. It was a remarkable twist, the return of a crown that didn't destroy freedom but helped to create it. For a while, Spain's royal family became the model of modern monarchy: respected, symbolic, and low drama. Until, of course, the scandals came, because it's still royalty. A life without thrones. What's fascinating is how these dethroned royals adapted. Some clung to titles, others reinvented themselves as authors, diplomats, or philanthropists. Simeon II of Bulgaria even went a step further. He became prime minister of his country in 2001. Imagine being crowned at 6, exiled at 9, and elected back by popular vote 50 years later. It's almost poetic, in a mildly absurd way. Many descendants of old monarchies still live quietly among us. aristocratic, polite, and a little haunted. They attend weddings of other ex-royals, give interviews about the old days, and smile for cameras that no longer care. Their palaces are museums. Their titles are just decorative. Their crowns are museum glass, reflections of when power came by birthright, not ballots. The story of monarchy didn't end in a single revolution or execution. It faded. Slowly. Softly.
Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've survived through a few centuries of royal melodrama. Let's sink a little deeper into the silk-lined chaos of the 18th and 19th centuries. This is the part of the story where thrones start wobbling, revolutions start brewing, and kings begin to realize that maybe, just maybe, people don't actually like being ruled forever. The 18th century was like a giant cosmic joke for monarchs. They'd spent hundreds of years convincing people that they were chosen by God himself. But then along came the Enlightenment, a bunch of philosophers in powdered wigs basically saying, actually, maybe we don't need a guy in a crown to tell us what to do. And suddenly, kings had a PR problem. Let's start with one of the most famous royal disasters ever, Louis XVI of France. Louis wasn't a bad guy. He just wasn't the guy for the job. Imagine a shy, awkward teenager suddenly inheriting the most powerful throne in Europe. He liked tinkering with locks, literally. He was obsessed with metalwork and keys. And he was married to Marie Antoinette, who was 17, Austrian, and immediately hated by everyone because she didn't understand why people couldn't just eat cake. The French economy was collapsing, the people were starving, and Louis was still holding elaborate hunting parties. You could almost hear the collective sigh of a country realizing they were done. And then came 1789, the year everything fell apart. The guillotine wasn't invented to make a statement. It was invented to make executions more humane. But it quickly became the sound of the old world dying. When Louis was executed in 1793, he supposedly said, "I die innocent," which was probably true, but also completely beside the point. The monarchy wasn't being punished for one man's sins. It was being punished for centuries of them. And Marie Antoinette? She followed soon after, in a cart through jeering crowds, hair chopped short, face pale, and still somehow composed. The crowd didn't care about her poise. They wanted her head. Literally. France's monarchy had been around for over 1,000 years. Gone in a few years of revolution, just like that. Let's float east for a moment, to another royal family that really should have paid attention. The Romanovs in Russia were like the Kardashians of absolute monarchy. Rich, out of touch, and always somehow in the middle of a scandal. Tsar Nicholas II genuinely loved his family. But he also genuinely believed that God wanted him to rule with absolute authority, which, as it turns out, is not a great combo. His wife Alexandra was German, deeply religious, and increasingly paranoid. She put her faith in Rasputin, the infamous mad monk, because he seemed to help their sick son, Alexei. And suddenly this bearded mystic was influencing royal appointments, whispering in the empress's ear, and partying across St. Petersburg. The nobles hated him, the people hated the monarchy, and the army, well, they were tired of losing wars and starving. By 1917, the empire cracked. Nicholas abdicated, not realizing that this wasn't a temporary break. He thought maybe they'd move to England and live quietly. The British royal family, who were literally his cousins, politely said no, which, in hindsight, was probably awkward. In 1918, the Romanovs were executed in a basement by Bolshevik soldiers. The age of Tsars ended not with a grand farewell, but with gunfire and silence. Back in Western Europe, monarchs were watching this unfold like people binge-watching a horror series, equal parts fascinated and terrified. Even Queen Victoria's grandchildren weren't safe from the domino effect. Her descendants ruled Britain, Germany, and Russia, which meant World War I was basically one giant royal family argument that spiraled out of control. Cousins were writing each other letters, "Dear Nicky, Dear Willie," right before sending troops to kill each other. It's the kind of tragic irony that would be funny if it weren't soaked in blood and arrogance. By 1918, the map of Europe had been redrawn. The German Kaiser fled. The Austro-Hungarian emperor was gone. The Ottoman Sultan was forced out. Monarchies that had ruled for centuries vanished in months. The world had turned against kings, and there was no turning back. Let's drift for a moment to Spain, because no story of royal downfall would be complete without a few melodramatic Bourbon twists. The Spanish royal family had already been through wars, inbreeding, and a few identity crises. But the 19th and 20th centuries, those were wild. Queen Isabella II, for example, was known for her scandals more than her policies. Her reign ended in exile after a revolution. Then came a brief republic, then another king, then a dictatorship, then another republic, then Franco, then finally, somehow, a restored monarchy again. It's almost poetic how the Spanish monarchy kept dying and resurrecting like a tired phoenix that just didn't know when to stop. Meanwhile, in Italy, the monarchy was trying to reinvent itself. King Victor Emmanuel III decided to make a deal with Mussolini, because when your throne is wobbling, why not team up with a fascist? Spoiler, that didn't end well. After World War II, Italians voted to abolish the monarchy. The king fled into exile, and the royal family wasn't allowed back for over 50 years. The pattern was clear. The old world was fading. Kings were out. Presidents were in. Thrones were being replaced by parliaments, constitutions, and, unfortunately, paperwork. Even the monarchies that survived, like Britain, Sweden, and the Netherlands, only did so by giving up almost all their power. The crown became decoration, not domination. But here's the quiet irony. People still loved the idea of monarchy. Not the real kind with taxes and wars, but the fantasy kind. The fairy tale weddings, the tiaras, the pomp. The kind you could admire from afar without having to live under it. It's funny, the same people whose ancestors fought to get rid of kings now line up to watch royal processions on television. Humans, it seems, never quite know what they want from power. Let's float into the modern era next, where crowns still sparkle, but only under studio lights. The world hasn't completely let go of kings and queens. It's just rebranded them as celebrities.
Hey there, Night Wanderer. Welcome back. You've made it all the way to the end, the quiet, modern age, where kings no longer rule the world, but they still somehow make headlines. So get comfortable. Maybe sip that last bit of tea, pull the blanket up, and let's drift together into the twilight years of monarchy. An age of cameras, tabloids, and nostalgia for power long gone. Because here's the thing, the world didn't exactly end monarchy. It just repackaged it. Once upon a time, kings had swords, armies, and divine rights. Now they have social media managers and public relations consultants. Let's start with the big one, the British royal family. Ah, yes, the Windsors, or as they were originally called, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, before World War I made that sound just a little too German. So they rebranded, like a restaurant chain after a scandal. King George V decided Windsor sounded much more British. He wasn't wrong. And from that point on, the British monarchy became less about ruling and more about existing gracefully under scrutiny. George's granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth II, would take that concept and elevate it into an art form. She didn't rule so much as she endured. Her power was not in decrees, but in silence, that royal poker face that said everything and nothing at the same time. For 70 years she sat on the throne, outlasting wars, scandals, and at least a dozen prime ministers. She met everyone, from Churchill to Obama, and somehow remained a mystery. The world changed around her, but she didn't, and that was her secret: stability in human form. Of course, the rest of her family was less consistent. There was Charles, the eternal heir who waited longer than most people's entire lifespans to finally become king. There was Princess Diana, the people's princess, who embodied all the contradictions of modern royalty: adored, hounded, tragic. And then came the era of tabloid chaos: divorces, scandals, interviews, Netflix dramatizations. The British monarchy stopped being a government institution and became a global soap opera. Every family argument became news. Every glance became a headline. The crown became not a symbol of divine right, but a stage prop, part of a centuries-long performance that everyone still tunes in to watch. Let's drift north for a moment, to Scandinavia, where monarchies somehow survived by being chill. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, all constitutional monarchies where the royal families ride bicycles, send their kids to public schools, and actually pay taxes. Imagine that. Their secret? They never took themselves too seriously. King Carl XVI Gustav of Sweden once got caught up in a scandal involving nightclubs and questionable photos, and the nation collectively shrugged. Because in Sweden, kings are basically just very famous old men with nice stamps. And then there's Spain again, because the Spanish monarchy just can't resist drama. After being restored by dictator Franco in the 1970s, King Juan Carlos actually became a national hero for defending democracy. But decades later, he fell from grace amid corruption scandals and an elephant hunting trip during an economic crisis. You really can't make this stuff up. His son, King Felipe VI, now spends most of his time trying to clean up the royal image, which in Spain is a full-time job. In the Netherlands, kings and queens literally retire. Yes, they abdicate willingly. Queen Beatrix stepped down for her son, King Willem-Alexander, who is basically the world's most laid-back monarch. He even flies commercial planes sometimes. So yeah, monarchy isn't what it used to be. Let's float for a moment beyond Europe, to the countries where monarchies still cling to power. In the Middle East, you have families that still hold genuine, absolute rule. The House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, the royal family in Jordan, the Emiratis of the Gulf. They've managed to blend tradition, oil wealth, and political control into something resembling the old divine right model, just with better technology and more skyscrapers. Then there are symbolic monarchies scattered around the world: Thailand, Japan, Bhutan, Malaysia, each with its own unique flavor of reverence and restraint. In Japan, the emperor once claimed descent from the sun goddess. Today, Emperor Naruhito spends most of his time giving speeches about peace while being treated with almost spiritual respect. The transformation from divine ruler to serene figurehead is complete and kind of beautiful. But for every crown that still shines, dozens have vanished. Think of Iran, where the Shah was toppled in 1979, or Ethiopia, where Emperor Haile Selassie, once seen as a living god, was overthrown and killed. Monarchies fall quietly now. No guillotines, no uprisings, just fading relevance. A slow, polite extinction. And yet the world still loves them. Every royal wedding floods the internet. Every baby announcement breaks Twitter. Crowns have become comfort symbols, nostalgic reminders of a world where power at least looked pretty. It's the paradox of monarchy. We don't want kings anymore, but we can't stop watching them. There's something hypnotic about the idea of inherited grandeur, even if we know it's just a costume now. The velvet, the ceremony, the centuries of stories built into every palace hallway. Maybe that's why we still care. Not because they rule, but because they remind us of continuity, a link to the past in a world that keeps changing too fast. As the lights of palaces dim and the world's attention drifts elsewhere, the monarchs who remain stand as living relics. They smile, wave, cut ribbons, and read speeches they didn't write. They exist, and somehow that's enough. Because in the end, monarchies didn't truly die. They evolved into myths. Soft, glittering echoes of what they once were. They are no longer the hands that shape history. They are the shadows that remember it. So as we close this long, quiet story, from thrones to graves, from divine right to daytime TV, maybe the real lesson is simple. Power always fades, but symbols linger. Crowns rust, but stories don't. And somewhere in an ancient palace, another royal heir is born, unaware that the world that once bowed before kings now simply scrolls past them. So as the world sleeps, the last crowns gleam faintly in the dark, not as rulers, but as reminders of a time when gold could make you God. Good night, and may your kingdom, whatever it is, stay at peace tonight. King.